What if some of your greatest assets you possess aren't really sitting in your bank account? What if they're buried inside the last 30, 40, 50 years of your life? The failures, the victories, the relationships, and then the business that you may have built or have been building, the things you've lost and the people you've met. Those, if you think about it, the mistakes we've even made, the painful lessons we've paid dearly to learn, the cost of the tuition is if we had to pay out of pocket for it. What if none of it was ever wasted? I want you to think about that. And what if the story hidden inside and what you've lived become the very thing that helps someone else move forward in life? That's what I want to talk about today in this episode, because I've come to understand something here about my own mission is your story was never meant to stop you. So we're going to talk about that in this episode. So grab a pen and paper, save this one because you're going to want to come back to it. We'll see you on the inside. So your story was never meant to stop with you. Okay. I'm going to show you how to turn what you've lived into what you're called to give. My name is Rick Kaufman, and I'm the host of the 318 Brotherhood Podcast and also the founder of the 318 Brotherhood and the author of The Ascension of the Warrior. And so what I want to talk to you about today really is, in the first part of this podcast is you may be sitting on something extremely valuable. I've talked to a lot of men who tell me something. I've always wanted to write a book. A lot of guys have a book inside them. I've got the story I need to tell somebody. I've thought about starting a podcast. I'd love to teach what I've learned. I know I'm supposed to do something. But Rick, I just don't know what it is. Maybe you've said something even similar to any one of these statements, but here's what I've been beginning to really just understand. The book isn't necessarily the thing, okay? It's not the end all or anything. Neither is the podcast that maybe you're wanting to start, but neither is a coaching program or ministry or the business as it's speaking or a speaking platform, like from the stage. I want you to think of these. Matter of fact, these are only vehicles by themselves. The real asset is what you've been living and what you've lived and what you've learned from those things. Because ask yourself a question. Would somebody want to know what you know? That's why I've spent much of my time recently developing what I call the kingdom balance sheet. The traditional balance sheet, it asks, what do you own? And what do you owe? But I believe there's another balance sheet we rarely even begin to look at. And what do you know? What have you experienced? And what expensive lessons have you learned? What skills have you developed in your relationships have shaped you? What have you survived and what have you failed? Have you even succeeded in life? What has God taught you through all of it? You might be looking at parts of your life, your past, and you see a lot of liabilities, a lot of expensive lessons, but they may be assets buried in them. There's gold in what you've lived. The question is whether you're willing to mine it out of yourself. Think about a prospector, always prospecting for gold. That's one of my hobbies. Well, it's actually a business that I have on the side where I scrap, but I primarily look for gold and silver. Just the other day, I was at a garage sale, found a 14 karat gold chain, marked plain as day. And they had it on the table for $1. And yes, I bought it. I bought it, and it has a value of over $2,000. 14 karat gold. It's packed. It was a heavy chain. We all have gold inside of us that we can mine, that we don't even know it's sitting on the table. We discount our value. This is a lesson on how God can provide for you and provide for others. The next thing is why do I do this? Why do I take this time inside the Brotherhood, inside the Ascension of the Warrior, inside this podcast, creating the content, making the phone calls, doing all the things that I do? I have become so passionate about men to help them uncover their stories. I know several men that are currently writing books. I know several men that I'm helping them write some books right now, guys that are part of our program, because I believe there is something very, very simple here. God doesn't waste what we've lived, not one bit of it. We have a tendency to throw it in the waistband, get rid of it because we don't think it's very valuable. Just like this gold chain, it had been sitting around for probably decades, probably in a box of stuff. It was just mixed in. Nobody saw any value in what was sitting there. That doesn't mean everything that happened to us was really good, okay? But it doesn't mean that every decision we made was God's decision. It doesn't mean that every painful experience was something we would ever have chose to experience again and again and again. But scripture tells us in Romans 8:28 that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. That's the very difference from saying something like everything that happened or happens is good. God can take something that wasn't good and produce something from it that serves his purpose. It's just like finding a gold nugget buried in the ground. You can't see it until you work through all the garbage and all the junk that's there. I've seen that in my own life. I wrote about it in The Ascension of the Warrior. Some of the things I've wanted removed from my story eventually became the very things that God really allowed me to understand. That's why hindsight matters. You couldn't see when you were standing right in the middle of the whole chaos and the mess. But now you're 10 years down the road, maybe 20 years or 30 years. And you can look backwards and say, now I understand something I couldn't understand then. That's what I would call wisdom. And somebody else may desperately need what it costs you years of your life to learn. Somebody needs that. Your story isn't about you. I would just want to make that clear. Nobody cares about your story. They really don't. What they want is what your story can teach them. What is it about them and their story? There's another important distinction here. When I say you have a story that needs to be told, I'm not saying everybody needs to hear about you or me. That's not the point that I'm really trying to make here. Jesus used stories consistently in his teaching. The story carried truth in it. It helped people understand something they couldn't see before. That's what makes your story very valuable. Your story isn't just valuable simply because it happened to you. I'm sure when I think about my own story, I think, man, everybody needs to hear my story. It can really make a difference in somebody's life. My story cannot do anything for anybody. It's my story. It only has a purpose to me. But there's lessons. See, there's value increase when you can extract the lessons and use that lesson to help somebody else. That's exactly what I do inside the 318 Brotherhood. That's the whole purpose behind the book and the story. And that's the whole purpose behind your book or your story that I want to help you write. How do I get people interested in my story? Okay, that may be a question you might be asking. So ask yourself this: who could be helped by what your story has taught you? Think about that one. That changes the question, changes the answer. Now the focus isn't on you, it's on the person you're called to serve. And we are called to serve. The Ascension of the Warrior is just a framework. That's all it is. This has also changed how I see my own book, The Ascension of the Warrior. For a long time, I saw it primarily as my story, but I don't really see it that way anymore. I'm laughing because it's something going on over here in the other room. But, my story is still there. I mean, it is. It doesn't go away. But I realize something here. The story is a case study. Your story is a case study. The 8 steps are the framework. My story is the work that I did. That's a huge distinction. Begin to put this together, we begin to understand something. And this is where, because of this, the 8 steps that's in the book can help you begin to uncover your own story. Use those for your benefit. So the first step in the Ascension of the Warrior is, what is God saying to you? So here's how to look at this. What keeps coming back? What's on your heart, and what story won't leave you alone? I want you to start journaling. That's where it starts. Step 2, it's divine appointments. Don't ignore people in our life, because who has God placed along the path for you? Who's influenced you in your life? Some of my biggest influences go back to when I was a teenager in high school and even into my college. They were my coaches. They taught me a lot that I carry on and I still teach today. Who challenged you? Also, who has hurt you? Who helps you? That's a big one. Who appeared at the exact right moment? Don't overlook the people in your story. Step 3, healing through hindsight. You might say go backwards here. Look at what happened with the perspective you have today. There's a saying, if you could go back and relive the past, knowing what you know today, would you do it? Most of us would say yes, but the only thing is we have to turn around and look at that perspective, because you probably wouldn't have the wife or the children, and there'd be a lot of things about your life that would be different because you would have made different decisions. So it's not about changing where you are now. It's important to understand what we mean by this. But instead ask this, what did this teach me? What couldn't I see that I can see now? That's where lessons begin to emerge. Step 4 is begin to trust the process that God is putting us through. So don't force any answer. I want you to journal. I journal every single day. Today is 1,529 days. I've been journaling every single day. This is about collecting information, organizing it, looking for patterns. Let the story begin to develop through this. Step 5 is divine provision. Look at what has already been placed in your hands. For example, knowledge, experiences, relationships, your skills, resources, and opportunities. Maybe you've been asking God to provide something He's already provided. Then we get into step 6, deny yourself. Eventually, resistance shows up. It always does. Nobody cares about your story. You're too old. You waited too long. You're not a writer. That's one I hear a lot. I don't write. But who do you think you are? You're going to have to decide which voice you're going to follow. You're going to follow God's voice or somebody else's out there that's all that has prejudged you, or your fear of what people might think about you. Step 7 is the master's blueprint. What does this become? Does it become a book, a podcast? How about a message, a business, maybe a ministry, a coaching program, or a conversation around the kitchen table, to start a Bible study? The story comes before the vehicle. It's important to understand that. That'll direct your steps. Step 8 is embrace your call. Finally, what problems have you learned to solve? Who is 1 or 2 steps behind where you've already been? How could your experience help that person move forward? That's when your story stops simply being something that happened to you. It becomes something that you can give to somebody. It's gold. It is something of value. God could use this to increase you, increase His kingdom, and increase all those around you. Then we turn around as, what are you supposed to give when you think about it? And that brings me to the statement I've been working through. Turn what you've lived into what you're called to give. Maybe what you're called to give is a book, to actually write a book. I've talked with so many men lately who are writing books right now on grief, loss, marriage, others such as wealth, business, family issues, and just some about their journey with God. I want to just say, maybe you're sitting here right now and maybe I'm talking to you, but don't begin by asking this: what should my chapters be? This isn't about figuring out chapters in a book, whether it's going to be a story, is it going to be fiction or nonfiction. Begin with, what have I lived and what did it teach me? What patterns do I see and what problems did I even learn how to overcome? Who needs this really? Think about that one. Then determine the vehicle, because maybe it isn't a book. Maybe it's your business or it's a ministry or even a podcast where you begin to do a podcast and you bring guests on or you just share like I'm sharing. Maybe you're supposed to mentor younger men or older men. Maybe it's something you haven't even considered yet, but it's there. Don't assume that the last 50 years were simply about getting you to where you are today. Perhaps they were also preparing you for what you're supposed to do. My mission is to help men uncover their story and understand what God is building through it. That's what I want the 318 Brotherhood to help men do. That's what I want my content to do. That's what I want this podcast to do, my book to do. That's what I want everything that I talk about do. That's what I want my coaching to do. Because I believe there are men walking around carrying decades of experiences who have absolutely no idea how valuable some of their experiences could be to somebody else. They think they're finished. They're just done. Retirement, I'm going to sit back and take it easy. I think they may be carrying the raw material for the next assignment. See, I see it so differently. Sometimes when we ask God for ears to hear and eyes to see, he will show us something that we've never been able to see before, and we'll hear something we never heard before. So here's what I want you to do now. I want you to take out your journal and don't start by asking, what should I do with the rest of my life? That's just way too big, okay? Start here. What have I lived that has taught me something somebody else needs to know? Write it down. Write 3 experiences down. Label them 1, 2, 3, maybe in importance, but just label 3 experiences down. One could be a victory, one could be a failure, one may be a painful lesson. Then underneath each one, answer this question. What did this teach me? And who could this lesson help? Don't worry about a book or a podcast or a business or a coaching or a website or a ministry. I want you to mine and find the gold here, because there may be a story hidden inside of what you've lived that you never taken the time to uncover. And perhaps someone else is waiting on the lesson buried inside it. They're there. There's hundreds of thousands of men. There's possibly millions. How could helping 100,000 men change your life and change the lives of so many more? Because it's not just 100,000 men. It's the families, the children that goes on for decades. That's legacy. That's why I do what I do. That's why I wrote The Ascension of the Warrior, and that's the mission I'm committed to, helping men uncover their story and understand what God is building through it. Because I want you to remember something. Your story was never meant to stop with you. Don't let it die inside you. I mentioned this in step 8. What caused me to write the book was a friend of mine. His name was Bob, just 5 years older than me or so. Was driving down the road. He had a heart attack and died in his car right there in the middle of the road. His daughter was following him. And I asked the question, why? He was like in the picture of health. He was doing fine. And God turned around and said, don't let your story die inside you. And he gave me an assignment to write this book. It's been a long journey, 1,529 days. Before I really close today, I want you to think about something. What if your story that you keep calling your past is actually preparation for your future? What if the failures you wish you could erase taught you something another man desperately needs to know? What if the pain you survived that gave you the perspective somebody else doesn't yet have? What if the experiences you accumulated over the last 30, 40, 50 years is simply evidence of where you've been? It's the raw material for where God is taking you next. There are men who will die with books that never been written, messages never spoken, lessons never shared, wisdom never passed on because they believed their story wasn't important enough. Don't let that be you, brother. You don't need to know how to write the book today or how to start a podcast, or you don't even need a business plan or a plan. You don't even need to know exactly where this is going, but you do need to do something, and that is start digging, going back through your life, looking at the victories and the failures and the people, and look at the pain, the expensive lessons, and also ask God one question. What did you build in me through what I've learned, and who needs to be taught this lesson? And then start writing in your journal, start putting it down, putting your thoughts down, recording your thoughts, either way, because somewhere inside what you've lived is a story. And inside that story is a lesson. And inside that lesson is a message. And somewhere out there is a person who may need that message. So, brother, if you made it to this far, I want to thank you for listening. And if you're interested, drop me a message on this podcast. Let's connect. Let's talk. Let's find out what raw materials you're playing with. And let's turn what you've lived into what you are called to give. Until next time, until next week, guys, this is Rick, 318, brother.